Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mardi Mataza, and I'm the president of the University of Sussex Politics Society. If you've joined us for events beforehand, welcome back. And if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. It's a very special day for me personally today for two reasons. First of all, we have an absolutely phenomenal guest who's here to join us. And the other reason is that it is Eid. So on behalf of the Politics Society, I'd like to wish everybody a very happy Eid. So about our speaker, we've got Gina Miller with us today. And frankly, I'm not quite sure where to begin. She's a successful businesswoman. She's one of Britain's most recognizable activists and campaigners for social justice. And she was voted the UK's most influential Black person. Yet, remarkably, none of those could be seen as her most prominent achievements. Most notably, she's taken the British government to the Supreme Court twice and won both in what would become landmark moments in Britain's exit from the European Union. So before we pass over to Gina, I'm going to introduce my co-host for today's event, Rebecca Preen. Rebecca is the president of the Law Society, but she'll introduce herself and she'll explain to you a little bit about the format we've got today and how it's a bit different from previous ones. So Rebecca, over to you.
Hi, so today's format will be a Q&A conversation between myself, Mardi, and Gina for about 40 minutes, and then we will open up the floor to you guys, the audience, to ask questions for the last 20 minutes. So there are two ways in which you can ask a question. The first was the question submitted prior to this event on Google Forms. But the second way is to comment down below on this live stream right now. And Mardi and I will do our very best to bring forth the questions and send them to Gina. But if you want any further clarification or if you have any questions in regards to what has been discussed in the first 40 minutes, please make sure you do comment down below. But yeah, without further ado, let's jump in, and I'm going to hand this over back to Mardi.
Thanks very much, Becky. All right, so Gina, so I'll begin with my first question to you. And what a situation we find ourselves in at the moment. A global pandemic, the country in lockdown, and the world brought to a resounding halt. For many of us, staying inside for this long it's a new and unfamiliar experience. But I know you've talked in the past about feeling like you've been in lockdown since 2017, after your first win against the government. So this must not be entirely new for you. So I just wanted to ask a little bit about what that's like and your thoughts on the pandemic and the government's response to it.
Well, thank you, Mardi and Rebecca, for inviting me today. Yes, it's a very strange situation for me and the family, because when the court case came to the attention of the media back in sort of just summer of 2016, the abuse started almost immediately, but not just online, but letters, threats against myself, my family, my children. And I was actually under police surveillance. We changed the way we lived our lives completely. So in effect, we became the most unsociable family you could possibly imagine for self-protection. So we stopped going out. If we were going out, it was a discussion about, should I wear a cap? Should I wear sunglasses? Should I, sort of try and disguise myself in some way? We stopped going to restaurants, theaters. Our life became very much smaller and really about home and the family more than anything. And so I suppose it was a self-imposed type of lockdown. So when the official lockdown happened in March of this year, in an odd way, it was a sense of relief, because now I had legitimate reasons for wearing a mask and hats and glasses and going out in disguise, but also the fact that people were distracted. There was so much going on that actually there was a huge decrease, because it's never really abated over the last 4 years or so. I still get on a daily basis the most horrendous abuse online, offline, through emails, calls, presents to my office. And I'm constantly on alert, if you like, in that sort of environment. So it was in an odd way a sort of relief that people were distracted elsewhere. But sadly, in the last sort of 3 or 4 weeks, it's back up to where it was before. So the abuse is back up to where it is. We're in a really febrile time still. But the way the government is handling this, I just think it's an absolute disgrace. Because on one hand, yes, we are unprecedented times, not just for the pandemic, but the fact that what it's doing on a global stage, what it's doing to a global economy, we've never seen before. You know, we've had pandemics in the past, we've had economic crises in the past, but they've never been at this scale, on a global scale. So those who compare it on the economic side to the financial crisis, the Great Depression, I believe that those are irrelevant, if you like, in the space of what we're facing now and will face in the future, in terms of its impact. But the way the government, the mixed messaging, and the fact that the messaging seems to be directed by the special advisor, by Dominic Cummings. And I say that from being a person who's run a marketing agency and had a background in marketing, is this whole idea of everything being in 3 words and a slogan is actually marketeering. It's not policy. And so we've got, you know, communications that are either mixed or being led by with opinion polls, what the polling says. You've got policy that's being trailed to see what public opinion is. That's not leadership, in my view. You know, we need decisive, competent leadership in the face of this pandemic, which will go on for some time. And the fact we've also seen the shutting out of expert voices, of companies offering help when it comes to procurement. You know, we have such conflicts of interest and such muddled communications that I feel that we are, as a country, being let down.
Yeah, but within this lockdown, you have been busy. As a result of the pandemic, you have been campaigning for will reform and have also recently launched messagesoflove.co.uk, which I believe is a website where individuals can post for free a digital memory box to be opened when the owner has died. So could you tell us more about this?
Yes, I mean, I irrespective of lockdown or not, I've always had at the front of my mind, in whatever situation, how can we help? How can I help? What is there that I can do that's practical? And during those years of abuse, one of the things I started doing, from my own experience, was to write letters to my children, just in case anything would happen, put away, because, you know, I want a different message. I'd say something different to my 13-year-old daughter than I would do to my 30-year-old special needs daughter. So, you know, wishes, memories of how I feel about things that they can visit if anything were to happen to me. And when the pandemic struck, I thought that's something that so many people feeling anxiety and feeling worried would also perhaps like to do. But I thought, you know, the fact is, if you do that, but then you're fine and you recover, that could actually change your relationship with friends and family. So it's a secure online way. It just seemed to me an obvious thing to do, to launch a platform where people can deposit things safely and securely. And if in the future they're fine and they want to delete them, they can do. But when I was doing the research on, you know, the appetite for such a platform, which turned out to be the thousands of people who did want to use it and have that facility, especially when you were becoming ill so quickly at bedsides, then the whole issue of wills came up. And people saying that they didn't have any guardianship arrangement for their children, for their pets, you know, how they wanted to be buried, where they wanted their favorite trinket, who would inherit it. It wasn't really about money. It wasn't about huge estates. It was about people being able to have their wishes left. And our will legislation is so draconian. It dates back to 1837. I know law tech has not been embraced in the profession. So it gave me an opportunity to tie the two things together, to say, yes, you can deposit your will, but actually let's talk about how do we use technology in a lockdown to make wills more accessible to the general public. So it's my campaigning voice has always been, what is it happening at the time that I can be involved with that can help to resolve problems, real problems that people are facing?
Right, thank you, Gina. Now, we have a number of questions about yourself, your career, and the fantastic activities you've taken part in, but we thought it'd be remiss if we didn't start off right at the beginning. So your upbringing and kind of what influenced you to become who you are at the moment. And so I think Rebecca's got a few questions about that. So I'll just pass over to her, ask some there.
Yeah. So I've read your biography, Rise, and it outlines all these events and tremendous barriers that you've had to overcome in your life. You were sent from Guyana to England at the age of 10 to a boarding school actually down the road here in Eastbourne. You studied law and then dropped out before your finals. You then founded successful companies in marketing and fund management, and then became a leading campaigner in hidden charges and investment, and then won against the government twice. So yeah, that summary doesn't do it justice, but the point is your emotional resilience just threads through, and the events were instrumental to shaping your outlook on the world. So my question is, was there any event in particular that you feel your drive came from?
I think it's not so much an event. I think it's an upbringing where I was really fortunate to have parents who instilled in me a real work ethic, but also this idea that everything you have can be gone tomorrow. So you have to care for it and care for what's around you, the people around you, not just the things, but also this sense of other people mattering. It's something that my father had a very strong view on justice, and what we, you know, it doesn't sit in law books. It doesn't sit in a courtroom. It's actually about people's lives and doing the best you can for them. And also the idea that we are all responsible for the world we live in. You know, it is not I was brought up to believe that civic duty was it's a central core responsibility in all our lives. You know, to sit and complain, where you actually have to do something positive to try and bring that change. So I've tried to do that. I failed many times. And I think part of what I've done, because I've been a campaigner for 30 years, and I say to people that you can actually learn to be a campaigner. You learn all the time. You learn to deal with abuse. You learn when to be at the front, when to be at the back, when it is time to collaborate, when it's time to say no, because others might be draining you of your positive energy because they have a different agenda. So you learn the tricks, if you like, of being a successful campaigner. And part of that is acknowledging that it takes tenacity. It takes, the biggest decision, I think, is deciding to act on something. Once you've made that decision, emotionally, psychologically, and physically, then the hard work begins. But that is the first barrier to get over. And it's learning when you can change something and when you can't, because sometimes it's too difficult to do on your own or to do even as a part of a group. And timing is so important. I've often failed because it was the wrong time. I sometimes say, I'm like that. You're probably too young to know this. So it's called a C5, and was shut away because it was before its time in electric vehicles. But you know, sometimes it's too early. Things have to come together, and I'm quite a fatalist. I think things happen for a reason. A bit like the court cases. I sort of knew it was going to be me. It sounds a very odd thing to say, but having survived a lot of abuse, I'm a survivor of domestic violence, and when someone has tried to take your life, believe me, anything else is not as big a fight as fighting for your own, your literally your life. So I think I was forged, if you like, through years of campaigning and failures and successes to be the person at that time. And I think right now I have a real sense of responsibility in where I am and where I sit, and people looking at me, to think that we are going to go through a time of real testing, your generation in particular. And what is it that I can do to use my experiences to hopefully inspire people to realize that actually they're going to have to change what happens next. They're going to have to shape what happens next and be responsible, because my generation, we've done as much as we can in sometimes, but it's time to pass the baton on. And, you know, I really hope that young people realize that this is a crucial time for them to find their voices.
Right. I see. And so just if I could draw on one of the things that you mentioned, you know, it truly is remarkable. And Rebecca has told me a great deal about some of the lessons that she's learned from your book. And you do outline a lot of the experience that you had suffering with domestic abuse. And in doing so, in outlining that, you really have become a trailblazing and inspiring figure for women, not only in the UK, but also across the world. And so, you know, it might be a little surprising then to then read that I think you've got some reservations with the Me Too movement. So I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
I think what happens, and I think we're seeing it with some of the Black Lives Matter movement as well, is that there are different people with different agendas. And these are very complex issues. And the minute you make them black and white, or you try and make them simple, you actually take away the nuance, and you take away the hard work that needs to happen from an infrastructure point of view, a funding point of view, an access point of view, that actually will create systemic long-term change. Because when we have the oxygen of opportunity, as we did with the Me Too movement, and we do now with Black Lives Matter, unless we really are careful with how we use that, what you do is you don't bring enough people along with you, because we've got to take everyone with us. Because if some people feel that you are taking their oxygen and they're going to lose something, then you need to sit and explain to them that this is about taking us all to a better place. It's not about you putting yourself above another. And so I worry about some of the campaigning and some of the tone of voice of some of the campaigning, because it's aggressive and puts people in a position where they feel they have to defend themselves rather than taking us to a better place. So that's why I have reservations. I think we have to be careful about how we campaign and what it is we're really, really asking for.
Yeah, you were actually voted most influential Black person of the year back in 2017. So where do we go now for racial equality?
I have to just to explain to you that award, the team who decided to choose me as the winner that year did it because they wanted to make a statement that there are forces in our country who are trying to divide us, not just from an economic point of view, but actually racially trying to divide the forces. So having me as someone from an Asian background being most influential Black person was a deliberate act, and I went along with that because it was a very important message. But the abuse I got for that award, and they did as well, I got abuse from quite a lot of commentators in the Black community saying, why is Gina Miller winning that? She's not Black. And then I got abuse from some of the Asian community saying, well, why did you accept the award? You're not Black. So it is that I wanted to make a point that there is no such group called BAME. There is no, we don't exist. We are all different communities who need to be recognized and and this is about equality. It's not about one being better than the other. And so it's really important that I want my message is that don't let the forces that be who have a particular agenda, particularly right-wing agenda, win by that divide and conquer. What they're doing is dividing us, and they're setting one against the other, brown against black, black against white, and whatever the colors are. The color of your skin is irrelevant in this debate about equality. But at the moment, you can't disregard the fact that Black Lives Matter. It is their time at the moment. Sometimes it's a time for women, sometimes it's for transgender, sometimes it's for homosexuality. Now it's their time, and we have to all support Black people, and because their issues and their suffering is different from ours, but we have to support each other when our moment comes. And that's where I think we have to be very mindful that we don't let those powers that be divide us and make us see each other as different.
Another one of the divides, so you've talked about Black versus white, brown versus Black, and another divide that's gained a lot of, let's sort of call it traction in recent years, has been the divide between the rich and the poor. And you've outlined some of the abuse you've received from another group, from a number of groups, and I'm sorry to bring up one more group to add to that, but also some of your colleagues in the financial sector, especially in 2012 when you started the True and Fair campaign, and you tried to increase and improve transparency in the financial industry, which I think many people did see as a necessity, especially after the crash in 2008. Faith in and trust in these big banks essentially deteriorated, and it's still being built up now. So, in your view, how much power and influence do these big banks have?
It's the entire financial services sector, because the sector operates in a way where it's in charge of the regulator is not strong enough. The people who were guilty in the financial crisis, we've never in the UK had someone held responsible, never. In other countries, people have been prosecuted. We still to today, 10 years later, we have never had anybody prosecuted after that fallout. The banks, we know that Lloyds, for example, Lloyds Bank, there was a lot of foreclosures of businesses. There were units set up that was just asset stripping people who had loans. And I'm very concerned that this may well happen again after where we are now with this pandemic, is that we could see similar bad behavior from some of the banks and institutions. But it's the only sector that operates on inflated, 40% plus profit margins compared to even the pharmaceutical industry. And of course they were angry with me, because why do they want transparency? Why would they want to give up that big fat profit margin? Why would they have to show people what they're actually doing in investments? You can't see what you're buying. You think about this from any other sector. If you went into a shop to buy a shirt and you used a credit card, and a month later, you went to the shop, you paid say £100, and then you got your credit card statement a month later and it said they'd taken out £150. You'd be pretty upset because you would have presumed that you paid the £100. Well, in financial services, in pensions, investments, the price you see is not necessarily the price you're paying, because they say that they're charging you, say, 1%, and they're probably charging you more like 2.5%. So my view was that you have to have transparency of fees, a ticket price in the industry for everything, any product, any financial product. But also you need to know what you're buying, because you don't know. You are not allowed to know what you're paying and what you're buying. That's just contrary to every single consumer right and law there is. And yet the financial services industry has its own laws and its own regulations, which are outside. Even in the world of advertising, financial services is the only sector that doesn't come under the Advertising Standards Authority. It's a law unto itself, but it's people's money. And I am very passionate about this, that, you know, we've got to change, and we're not changing enough. And when it comes to the culture of the city, you know, we have a misogynistic male-dominated culture where only 8% of the senior deal makers in sort of 650 firms in the city are women, and only 1% are Black. I mean, the culture has got to change, and the behavior has got to change.
Absolutely. We actually received a lot of questions from the audience before this event about your thoughts and reflections on working in a predominantly white and male-dominated industry. So we will touch on that later on in the interview. But I just want to...
I was going to say the other thing about this, that, you know, a much bigger question, which I think post-pandemic, and for your generation, it's a really important one, is that has capitalism actually worked? Because you talked about the divide, you mentioned the divide between rich and poor. Well, trickle-down economics actually did lift a lot of people out of poverty, but it made a huge number, well, a small 1% of the people incredibly rich, and put a huge millions and millions of people into poverty. So that divide has actually gotten worse. So I think we need to have a conversation about what is capitalism, and is there a better, more responsible capitalism that we should be pursuing in the future?
It's interesting that you said that, because that was actually my next question about. So it was in the light of the financial crisis and talk over responsibility within the sector. You have something like the Occupy Wall Street movement that comes out, talking about a solution to this being abolishing capitalism, abolishing the free market entirely, moving towards a different economic system. But you said in an interview with the Foreign Policy magazine in 2016 that instead of abolishing it, we need to have a responsible capitalism instead. So you've talked about the fact that we need to have that discussion, but do you have any thoughts on the notion that we need to abolish this system because it simply doesn't work for the people that it's supposed to?
I think the first thing I'd say is you have to look at who has power, and money, you know, money is about power. If you look at corporations, we have to start there. We have to start with the way everybody connected and the whole ecosystem of a corporate world. And my view is that we need to start the aggressive pursuit of profit, which was the capitalist mantra, has to change to a pursuit of a triple bottom line, which is not just about profit. It's about profit, people, and planet. And if you have an equilibrium where you balance those three out together, then we would have better behavior, we'd have better products, we'd have better environmental responsibilities. The ripple effect of just that one action, I mean, it sounds a simple one action, but it's a huge action. If all companies have to report a triple bottom line, the behaviors that will change will be seismic.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I want to ask on behalf of the law students out there watching this. So I'd like to turn to the Supreme Court, i.e. your fight against the government, or should I say fights, plural, against the government. You also mentioned in your biography that your childhood taught you to stand up for whatever you believe in is right, no matter what the personal cost. You started off dealing with law as a law student, only to find yourself 30 years later in front of the Supreme Court, having won a case against the government twice. First over giving MPs a vote, which is actually called the Miller No. 1 case in our public law textbooks. And then the prorogation of Parliament, Miller No. 2. So my question is, what was your motivations for bringing the first case and then the second one?
The first, they were both connected, but the first case was fundamentally about parliamentary sovereignty. The very thing that, you know, many of the Leave campaigns were banging on the table about was, and they were absolutely right about it, it is vital. Parliamentary sovereignty in a representative democracy is a core of our constitution. And what Prime Minister May was going to do was bypass Parliament. And I saw that as having two very fundamental problems. One is on the domestic front, for domestic law, we were bypassing Parliament. But in the international landscape, we were bypassing the requirements of Article 50. Now, if you hadn't, Article 50 says you can leave along the lines of your constitutional requirements. Our constitutional requirements is you consult Parliament. So we would have actually contravened international law as well as UK law. And just play that forward for a minute. So we trigger Article 50, we don't consult Parliament, we leave the EU, we haven't got a plan in place because they hadn't, so we just literally would have left on WTO terms. Now, could have all those WTO members, so you go from 27 EU members to 164 country membership of WTO. Could any of them have turned around? I argue they could have, and sued us for contravening an international treaty. So we wouldn't have been able to do any deals with anybody. Imagine that situation where we would have broken international law as well as domestic law. Until that case, or whatever legal action potentially could have been brought against the United Kingdom, if that had taken years, we would be in limbo. Imagine the economic damage. I mean, obviously, we didn't know COVID was even a word then that we were going to be in this pandemic. But to me, it would have fundamentally changed us as a country, both economically and legally. But from a constitutional point of view, it would have set a precedent, and you know this because our law is set in precedent, that any prime minister could bypass Parliament. Can you imagine how dangerous that is as a precedent? So that was very important. And it was even more important in the prorogation case, because I was working with whistleblowers who had told us that the prime minister and the cabinet weren't, if you remember, there was this Benn Act that had been passed where the prime minister had to bring back whatever happened in Europe to Parliament under the Benn Act. And I was told that what their plan was to prorogue Parliament, close it down for supposedly 5 weeks, but then actually never bring it back until post the 31st of October, which is why they were never worried about the Benn Act. So it was important that Parliament was not shut out in that case again.
I'm glad you mentioned the Constitution, or lack thereof, because I remember on ITV Loose Women, you described the Constitution as a gentleman's agreement. So after 2 successful cases over the 3 years, do you think the British Constitution is stronger or more vulnerable than ever? And would a written constitution be a good or a bad idea?
I think our entire democracy and constitution and rule of law is in danger because of the agendas that this particular government have, and that you see they're threatening to bring in a commission review on judicial review. Now, the problem with that is I see that as a political act against me, and they've actually said they've quoted my cases, because judicial review is a fundamental part of people getting access to justice. I mean, it was used in the Hillsborough review. Judicial review was used by people who have been thrown out of their homes illegally. It is a vital part. And actually, I would review it, but increase it, because we have so little access to legal aid. So there's a lot of reviewing and a lot of a review of the law and the infrastructure of the justice system that needs to be reviewed, but not from the lens that they will use, I believe. But a constitution, I think now we need to think about a partially written constitution, because there is a hybrid. A written constitution can be quite restrictive, and the argument for those who actually support an unwritten constitution, such as Lord Sumption, is that it gives us that flexibility. Well, I think there are some things that we can still codify, such as our human rights and employee rights. I think there are things that we can codify and not lose the flexibility of the constitution.
Right, thank you, Gina. So, the overarching theme here is, of course, the defining political moment of our generation, as it's been called, and that is Brexit. So I have a few questions about Brexit and some of the events surrounding that, and then bringing it back to the current state as well, before we move over to the audience question of this event. So tomorrow it will have been 1 month to the day that the government had a deadline to apply for an extension for the transition period of our deal with the European Union. The deadline passed and no extension was sought. Where do we now stand?
Legally, we leave on the 31st of December, deal or no deal, any sort of deal, paper thin, whatever it is we come away with, we leave with on the 31st of December. And that is what is so terrifying for 75% of the business community, as the latest survey from CBI shows, that because now the pandemic has hit, we don't have the time or resources for them to be prepared for a no deal. And I do believe, because I started on the Brexit campaign, if you like, in October 2015, when I was approached to be a spokesperson for Remain. And I have to say, even from day one, I felt that the messaging was wrong. It should have been Remain and Reform. But that was my take, because I think there are quite a few things that need to be reformed in the EU. But where we are today is that legally, and we have left, and there is no legal way of us requiring an extension or bringing this back to the table. Whatever the government agrees or negotiates between now and December, that is it. That is the legal position. And I am very concerned that they seem to be very happy to have no deal, because they still don't understand the consequences of WTO. WTO, we are an 80% service economy. We are not a trading economy, we are a service economy. And the WTO arrangements around services are very embryotic. It's not as advanced as the EU. So we're going to be on a learning curve with WTO on services. And I think with the combination of the pandemic, which is not going to be over next year, we are going to be starting January 2021 with a paper thin deal, if we do get a deal, or WTO terms, and still in the midst of a pandemic. And the two together are pure madness, complete and utter catastrophe as far as I'm concerned.
So yeah, you said we're leaving on the 31st of December. Is this Brexit chapter over for you? And is this the last time we see of Gina Miller in the public eye?
Oh, I'd have no intention of going anywhere. But in terms of Brexit, I said that once Parliament was involved, that was the combination of the Withdrawal Act that went through Parliament at the end of January and the coronavirus emergency legislation that went through in March means that this government have more power in the combination of those two acts. They are not answerable to anyone at the moment. They can more or less do what they want. With an 80 majority overlaid as a cherry on the cake, they are going to be able to bring in such incredible, the trade deal, the trade act that went through unamended just before Parliament rose is extraordinary in it, because it has no protections on food standards, on animal welfare, and in it there is no right for Parliament to debate any of the trade deal with the US. That is extraordinary that act went through. So I'm going to sit on the sidelines and watch, because if they start impinging on our human rights, breaking procurement law, there are other areas we need to look at. And I'm not saying it's about the court. I think now it's going to be, as we move forward, it's going to be about the court of public opinion. I think we as individual citizens need to be more alert than ever before, because Parliament doesn't have the power, unfortunately, because of what's happened. It doesn't have the same level of power because of those two acts and the 80-seat majority.
Right. So one of the reasons put forward by pundits about why Brexit happened, why Remain lost the vote, was a lack of engagement with the Labour Party. Now, you've got a very interesting relationship with the Labour Party. It goes back several years. So just to give a little bit of context there, you actually helped draft a section in the 2015 Labour manifesto on, I believe it was pension reform. And then you left the party. Why was this?
Well, I left when Mr. Corbyn became the leader, because I didn't feel that he was the person who could lead the party where it needed to go. And because his advisors, all governments had advisors, all political leaders had advisors, but to have filled his office with people from the unions and actually not take advice from those in the party and shut out a huge sway of the party, I felt was the wrong way to go. And that, you can't divide the party, which is what he did. I think to be in opposition, to be a successful opposition party, you need to have a united party. Why fight amongst yourselves? And then finally, the final straw for me was actually when I resigned from the Labour Party, was when I saw the draft of the anti-Semitic report, the Chakrabarty report, because my husband is Jewish, my entire, my extended family are Jewish, and it was a cover-up, and we're now seeing that. But that original report, I was so shocked at how little they'd investigated that was just a final straw for me.
I mean, there's been talk now of Jeremy Corbyn having the whip removed as a result of his response to the Labour Party settling in the recent court case. Do you think that's likely?
I don't. I think the Labour Party has to be mindful of how much it's got to fight at the moment. And if they make him, if you like, almost a martyr, if they go after him, I don't think that's the right thing. Revenge is not the way forwards. I feel that they have to sort out the issues within the party, from anti-Semitism to policy to funding. It needs to be rebuilt. They have a bit of time, so I wouldn't say it's a detraction of energies that are needed elsewhere.
Right. So you've mentioned 3 things that they could potentially work on. What about now? New leader, new shadow cabinet, and by Keir Starmer's own words, under new management. What looks like to be a radically different approach on combating anti-Semitism. Do you think this is different enough for you to rejoin at some point?
I'll watch and wait, because they still have. We're not in a place where they're talking about policy as yet, and that's quite right. I think come next year, when they start talking about policy, I'll be interested to see what sort of a Labour Party this is, truly. And also, Keir is doing a brilliant job. He is a perfect antidote to Boris Johnson at Question Time. We've seen that, and we know his background, we know his forensic approach. But I want to see more of the shadow bench. I still don't feel that we're seeing, you can't have a one-person party, as much as Boris might think he can. But I think you have to see the competency of the shadow cabinet as well. So once we see more of that, we see more policies, more announcements, where the party will go, then I would be very interested in joining, but I'm not there quite yet.
I see. All right, so I'm going to mention one quick thing before I ask my final question, and then we'll move over to the audience section. So if any of you do have questions you'd like to ask Gina, whether it be about something that she said, something we've asked, or a different topic entirely, do put the comment in the feed below the stream, and we'll have a look at those and read some out. So my final question, we've talked about the Labour Party, and we've talked about the government, so the Conservative Party. So who do we have left? And in my opinion, we've got the Lib Dems still left to speak about. And so when Sir Vince Cable stepped down in 2018, he publicly stated that he wanted the next leadership election to be open to non-MPs. And I have a feeling you know what question I'm going to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And so here you are. You're a businesswoman and an activist who comes and takes the country by storm, and whether you wanted to or not, became one of the de facto faces of Remain. You had the stage seemingly set up for you. So why didn't you contest the Lib Dem leadership election?
I think there is still so much to do that needs to be apolitical, that needs to be fundamental change. As I said, responsible capitalism, when it comes to what I think is needed now as we go towards environmental change as well. I think that it's a wrong time. It was a wrong time, and it still is a wrong time. When you are an independent, I mean, the problem is once you become part of a party, you are part of that structure, and it can be quite restrictive from the point of view of whipping, and you have to collective responsibility, which is right. But to actually be able to really challenge, I need to be independent. I need to be I need to be apolitical, because I think true change that our country needs is apolitical. So for the moment, I'm not saying never, for the moment, it was just wrong timing. And to me, timing is very important.
I see. Well, that means it's now time for the audience section.
Yeah.
So I've got a few coming in now. So sorry, Becky, I'll let you start with that.
Yeah, I was going to link to one audience question where it says, you have said that you became conscious of the direction the referendum was heading before the Remain campaign. So what went wrong with the Remain campaign?
Oh gosh, that's a huge question. I think there are many aspects of it. I think that the people who were in charge of the Remain campaign didn't actually go out of the country. They really were. The accusation about they're in a West London bubble, they were. Because I deliberately went out. I mean, they thought that I was getting the short straw when I'd go out and do events outside of London. And in the February of 2016, I came back and I said to the group that we're going to lose. And they sort of almost literally patted me on the back and said, don't worry, Brits don't take chances. They saw it as, and actually I have to say, most of the Leave side were saying the same thing when I was on debates. Nobody really thought that the British public would actually vote to leave on either the Remain or Leave side. And I think the remain, the negative. You've got to talk about hope. You've got to recognize as well. First of all, you've got to acknowledge people's hurt. You've got to acknowledge and accept that they have legitimate grievances, and then you have to explain why those grievances are not resolved by leaving the EU. So on immigration, for example, which became a big totem for Farage and for the leavers, you have to, we didn't do enough of explaining that leaving the EU was not going to stop immigration from Africa and India. That it's something as basic as that. But I think our messaging was all wrong. It was too aggressive. It wasn't acknowledging enough people's hurt. We didn't take the time to explain what it is, why we wanted to remain. We should, the biggest thing for me was to remind people that it wasn't just about money, and we allowed the other side to say it was predominantly about money. It wasn't. It is actually, the EU is it's a peace project, because you don't, the idea is you trade with your neighbors. You don't go to war with your neighbors. That was one of the fundamental pillars of the EU and us joining it. But the other thing we didn't explain was what a significant voice we had in the EU. We had such soft power. We were able to sit at the top table, even though we already had a special relationship. Remember, we were not in the Euro. We were not in Schengen. They'd already given us a special relationship because they valued our advisors. They valued our soft power, and they valued our voice at the table between the Franco-German axis that dominates the EU. So I think the EU is actually really going to be the poorer for us leaving, not just from an economic point of view, but actually the way the operation of the EU works and the institutions of the EU, because they won't have the brilliance of the British that was there before. And that was something that was never really explained.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. And so linking to that about the unique and specialty we were already given. Well, there's two questions. I'll ask one, and then Rebecca will ask the next one. But this one from Arnab: do you think that the Eurozone will survive?
I think they have a lot of problems. Pre-COVID, the worry was China. The EU is very concerned about what is happening in, well, Russia to some degree, but predominantly China, and the way they're buying up debt in Europe and the UK, but also the way they're behaving to their neighbors in Asia. So pre-COVID, it was China. Now it's China, plus the fact that they're being criticized by their smaller members for the way they're bailing them out and how they've reacted. Because one of the things I find actually is a criticism of the EU is that what if they are one member, one bloc and protecting each other, why didn't Germany share the app with the rest of Europe? Why did everybody go off and run around trying to make their own app? If you have free movement and you have a collective bloc who act as one, then Germany, when they developed that app, they should have shared it with every other member state. So that's just one criticism I've got of the way they've dealt with things at the moment. But I think from an economic point of view, we're already seeing the fracturing. We could end up with a two-tiered EU, where you have the bigger members in the sort of an onion, in the center, in the core, and then you have satellite membership. So I think post-COVID, there will be change in the EU.
Right. I mean, from the way that you've described it, and being just watching the news, following the news, seeing the responses and the proclaims made by leaders across the world, there definitely seems to be a shift towards nationalism and away from globalization. Is this, I mean, perhaps it might be a bit dramatic to say, is this the end of multilateralism? But are we moving towards a global village where people really begin to focus inside and stop looking outside? Because in our talk before the event started, you talked a little bit about the volatility and the lag of investments throughout the world. You've got say a topsy-turvy financial market at the moment. Where do we move from now? Like, is this really the end of the global village as in its current form?
It may be in its current form, but I think we have to fight very, very hard to ensure that we do have multilateral organizations and institutions, because you are seeing the rise of nationalism, but the issues we're going to face in the future do not have borders. So be it environmentally, all the experts say we are going into an age of pandemics, be it not just in humans, but in plants, in animals, in insects. We have many issues coming that do not have borders. So we need to have multilateral organizations to ensure that we can tackle those issues coming up. But at the same time, sovereignty is a very important and to everybody. And I'm worried that post-pandemic, there is this rise of nationalistic fervor because, and politicians, too many politicians are taking advantage of it and walking away from multilateral organizations. Obviously, Trump is the biggest example. But I think we need to be very careful because we are going to a new world as well. There is a new sort of enemy, if you like, and there are state actors such as China and Russia who are threatening all of us, and we do need to act as one against them. And then we haven't even started talking about the age of technology and what will, if we close down, but we have an internet, which is a global connected village where, we are globally connected. You're not going to get rid of that. What are the threats that the users of technology will use against one nation, against the other? So we do need to be part of a multilateral organization that keeps tabs and keeps an eye on what happens with the coders of the future.
We've just received a question from Kate Carrington saying that you said that Britain leaving the EU make the EU poorer economically and in terms of political decision making. How do you think the withdrawal of Angela Merkel will affect the EU further?
I think Germany is a federal state, a federal country. So it isn't actually, it doesn't operate the same way as us. So because of that federal nature, it tends to be much more resilient than we are in the UK. And so I think Merkel will not have a bigger impact in Germany as we would, but then it depends who takes over from her, because the biggest problem Germany has at the moment is the rise of the right in different states and provinces, and the federal challenge to the central power, if it's a more of a right-wing movement, is something that Germany really has to worry about. And this pandemic hasn't helped that.
There is an interesting question from the Google form, and I'm just going to rephrase the question a little bit, which essentially it asks, in your opinion, did the Supreme Court act outside of its jurisdiction for the Cherry Miller case, which is Miller number 2?
Absolutely not. The politicians like to reposition it and say they did, and sort of talked about the courts parking on the political lawn. But actually, the legal system, the law, has always been able to hold politicians to account if they put themselves above the law. And shutting out Parliament was putting itself above the law. So therefore, it was a legitimate legal consideration for the courts to act in that way. I mean, if you go all the way back to the 1600s, the courts have always had the power to question Parliament putting itself above the law. And so it was a complete, if it had been such an issue, we would not have had a unanimous judgment in the case, because the judges are actually very different, have very different views on the Constitution and the role of law. And yet there was a unanimous decision, because when you think about it in its purest form, it was the simplest of cases. You cannot shut out MPs in a representative democracy. That is what parliamentary sovereignty is, and it's the fundamental core to our constitution, our legal system, and our democracy. So in a case, it was almost a sort of one-page case. It wasn't difficult to argue.
Right. We've got loads of fantastic questions coming in, but in the interest of time, we're only going to pick just a few more. So 2 more from me and 2 more from Becky. So my next question, again, for another audience one, comes from Sophie, and it's another one relating to the EU. And I promise this is the last one on the EU, then we'll move on to some others. And so I suppose just to give a little bit more context, the term once in a generation, it was applied to the vote that resulted in us joining the common market. It was also applied again to the Brexit vote. People say that this is a once in a generation vote. We've left the European Union and we will not join again for the foreseeable future. But there are still many who say that under a different premiership, a different party, a different administration, that might change. And there's been a fair bit of discussion about that. But under what circumstances do you see Britain joining the European Union again? And that's from Sophie.
Well, Sophie, I think there's a preamble to that question, which is, are we going to be a United Kingdom post-pandemic? Because there's a lot of talk about what is called an arc union, where Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland actually approached the EU for some sort of membership. We don't, not full membership, but some sort of membership, which leaves the England by itself. So, you know, we have a question before that, is the union, you know, is that one in the lifetime vote, Brexit, did that cause the breakup of our union? And I'm, you know, looking at the polls, I am very concerned that that could happen. So, you know, the one, and the other thing to remember, Sophie, is that no parliament can bind the hands of a future parliament. So if there is a generational shift, which there is in our population, and in the future, you know, your generation decides, say 10 years at time, that you want another referendum and you want to see if you want to join whatever happens to the EU, because we have to see, you know, we're in flux all around the world, all institutions are in flux. And, you know, in 10 years time, you might decide, that government might decide popular, you know, the public demand might be for another referendum. So it isn't once in a lifetime, and it isn't over, because you can always, a parliament can always enact for another referendum.
Right, and so I'd just like to follow up on that with a question of my own, and it's kind of two-faceted, I suppose, but it's entirely up to you how you choose to answer. And, you know, so as someone that has really kind of been at the grassroots level, working on campaigning, working on campaigns that involve people from across the political spectrum throughout the country, do you have any sense of, are we truly a disunited kingdom? And I mean that in two ways. First, in the way that you've outlined, in that the polls suggest that there may be a breakup of the union at some point in the future. But then also, in terms of political disunion, are we moving towards a firm two-party system, left versus right, similar to what we're seeing in the United States at the moment?
I do worry that we're moving to a one-party state rather than a two-party state, because coming up in autumn, we've got the boundary changes that are going to be debated as well. So not only have we got a party that has the 80-seat majority, but the boundary changes will actually increase the number of seats that the Conservatives can win at the next election. So I am very concerned that we are moving to a place where we could have, you know, unless people take to the street, we could see that this Conservative government will stay in term for two terms, which is terrifying to me. And, you know, their plan, as far as I'm aware, and speaking to people who are worried about, you know, the competency of this government, I say that you might not have a competent prime minister, but there are many people in the party who are very competent, but have a very strong right-wing ideological view of what this country should be like. And I worry about their political agenda. And part of that agenda is to diminish institutions that hold them to account, be it the civil service, be it the courts, be it individual voices. So I think we should be greatly concerned that our democracy is actually being damaged hugely.
So you don't see a possibility that Keir Starmer ends up beating Boris Johnson in 2024?
Well, first of all, I don't think it'll be Boris Johnson. I think the Conservative Party will do anything to stay in power. And if Boris Johnson is not doing well in the polls, he'll be got rid of, and it'll be somebody else. And also, there is disquiet in the party from all that I hear about his advisor having so much power. So, you know, it's I don't think we can take it as a given. I wouldn't take it as a given that will be Prime Minister Johnson fighting that next election. But the problem is here, it's really going to be difficult. I mean, obviously, I would like it because I think democracy, our country works best when we have a change of government. We have had a Conservative government now for far too long, in my view, but it's not going to be easy. With the changes that are there, it's just not going to be easy. And what I'm hoping will happen is that we have, and there are good Conservative backbenchers, there are really good MPs in Parliament, and I would hope that some of those backbench Conservatives actually start speaking out about our security, about our country, about what's happening.
One of the names floated for a potential successor for the Prime Minister is the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak. Are we seeing a potential Prime Minister in waiting and our first non-white Prime Minister?
I think my view is that his last speech was definitely putting his hat in the ring. The last speech he made wasn't just about a budget, and he is riding incredibly high in the polling within the Conservative Party voters, not just the country. But we have to see where he comes out of, because he's basically, he's acting more like a socialist chancellor than a Conservative chancellor out of necessity. and it's only right. And I would say he needs to go even further. But I'm not sure the Conservative Party will put up somebody from ethnic minorities to be the leader of their party. I don't think that party is ready for that.
Yeah, I'm just conscious of time, and there's a question that refers to what you mentioned at the beginning, and it is, what is your advice to other professional women and women of color of how to navigate a white male-dominated work environment?
You have to have tenacity. You have to, I'd say, act with grace, but do not take no for an answer. Do not allow them, the microaggressions of putting you in your place, of literally sitting you at the back of a room or the end of the table, or in, making a comment about the way you look, the way you dress, when you should speak. Those are all microaggressions that you have to resist. And don't let people put you in your place. Literally, do not let them sit you at the back of the room. Make sure that you are there front and center and noticed, and rehearse what you say, and make sure that you keep calm, but use your intellect. Don't use your anger. It's very easy to get angry, but you actually need to use your intellect and prove a point, because when you break through, you're clearing a path for others. So you need to change unconscious biases. You need to change people's perceptions of you. And aggressive, angry Black woman, or I'm just a shrill, whatever it is, names I get called. I've been in the city, as I said, since '96. I've probably been called just about every name there is. But I have always stood my ground, and I have not let them. I mean, I will not. To me, bullies are the weaker. We are stronger when we don't bully, and I will not let them win.
Yeah, I'm just going to finish up with one final question, and it says, what is Gina Miller's legacy?
I did my best. That's all I can do.
I think that sums it up perfectly, and your best definitely seems to have profound impacts upon the Brexit process and our democracy. So thank you very much, Gina Miller, for joining us today. It's been a phenomenal conversation, and we're glad you've been able to take the time out to speak to us. Now, thank you also to all of you for joining us for this event, and a particularly big thank you to the Committee for the Law Society and Politics Society for working extremely hard to put together these questions and make sure this event runs without any hitches, especially to Peter Galizzi. And so I'm just going to give you a heads up of another event we've got coming up next week, which I think you'll all enjoy very much. And that's with the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, who we'll be speaking to on Monday on a number of different topics, including morality and religion, the church in the 21st century, and a number of issues associated with that. So we very much hope that you'll join us for those events. So I'm just going to pass it over to Becky now to say goodbye, and then we'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Thank you very much, guys, for joining in, and we hope you found this as insightful as we have. But yeah, have a rest, have a nice day, rest of your Friday. It's really sunny and hot, so I'm just going to go outside. But yeah, thank you very much, Gina. Thank you, Mardi.
Brilliant. And so, once again, guys, on behalf of the Politics and Law Societies, a very, very happy Eid. And we hope to see you soon. And make sure you like both the Politics Society and the Law Society on Facebook. It is important that you do that to keep up to date with the great events we've got coming up and the other collaborations that our two societies have moving forward. And we hope to see you then. Bye-bye.